Somewhere in the misty mountains of Hungary, there is a castle that locals still refuse to enter after dark. Centuries have passed, the walls have crumbled, the forests have grown thick around it, but the people who live nearby, they still whisper. They whisper about the screams that used to echo through the valleys at night, screams that nobody investigated, screams that powerful men chose to ignore. And at the center of it all, one woman, one name, Elizabeth Bathory, the most prolific female serial killer in recorded human history. But here is what nobody tells you. She was never convicted. Let that sink in for a moment. Over 600 victims, decades of terror, and the most powerful woman in Hungary died without ever standing trial. Why? Because the truth of what happened inside Csejte Castle was so dangerous, so politically explosive, that the people in power decided it was safer to bury it than expose it. And they almost succeeded. Almost. You are about to hear the story that historians debated for centuries. A story of blood, power, betrayal, and a woman so terrifying that even kings were afraid to speak her name out loud. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in all of Europe. Let that register for a second. This was not some outcast. This was not someone who grew up in poverty or desperation. She was born into privilege so extreme that her family had its own private army. Her uncle was the king of Poland. Her cousin was the prime minister of Hungary. The Bathory name was not just respected, it was feared. And from the very beginning, Elizabeth was treated like royalty. She was educated at a time when most women could not even read. She spoke 4 languages. She was described by everyone who met her as breathtakingly beautiful. By the age of 15, she was engaged to Ferenc Nadasdy, one of the most celebrated war heroes in Hungarian history. On paper, Elizabeth Bathory had everything, but something was already wrong. Before her marriage, at the age of 13, Elizabeth gave birth to a child from a relationship with a lower-class man. The child was hidden. The man was castrated and fed to dogs. And Elizabeth, she moved on, like nothing had happened. That is the first moment historians point to, not as proof of guilt, but as a window into something darker, a coldness, a detachment from consequence that would define everything that came after. She married Ferenc Nadasdy in 1575. The wedding lasted 3 days. Thousands of guests attended. The King of Hungary sent gifts, and for the next few years, Elizabeth lived the life expected of a noble wife, managing estates, raising children, corresponding with her husband, who was constantly away at war. But Ferenc Nadasdy had a habit that historians believe planted a very specific seed in Elizabeth's mind. He tortured servants for entertainment. This was not uncommon for the era. Brutal treatment of lower-class workers was widely accepted, but Nadasdy took it further. He invented new methods. He introduced Elizabeth to the concept of pain as control, as power as pleasure, and Elizabeth, she was a very fast learner. Here is where the story takes its first dark turn. While her husband was at war, Elizabeth began running the estates alone, and the complaints started coming in. Servants disappearing, girls from nearby villages vanishing after being recruited to work at the castle, local priests reporting that bodies were being buried quietly in the night. But every time someone raised a concern, they were silenced, because Elizabeth Bathory was nobility, and in 1590s Hungary, you did not accuse nobility of anything. Her husband died in 1604, and that is when everything accelerated. With Ferenc gone, there was no longer even a minimal restraint on Elizabeth's behavior. She moved to Csejte Castle, a remote, fortress-like structure deep in the mountains, and within months, the whispers became screams. Young girls, mostly from poor peasant families, were recruited to the castle under the promise of work and good pay. Families were desperate. The offer seemed legitimate. After all, who would refuse a position working for the most powerful noblewoman in Hungary? So they sent their daughters, and those daughters were never seen again. The methods used inside that castle, documented later by witnesses and survivors, are difficult to describe without pause. Girls were beaten until their bodies gave out. They were kept in freezing conditions, starved, mutilated. Some accounts describe Elizabeth herself participating directly, not watching, not ordering directly, with her own hands. There are records of her biting flesh, of her using specially designed torture instruments, of girls being dragged from dungeons in the middle of winter and doused with water until they froze to death in the courtyard. But then comes the detail that turned Elizabeth Bathory from a brutal aristocrat into a legend. The blood. Multiple witnesses, including surviving servants who later testified, described Elizabeth bathing in the blood of her victims. The belief, allegedly, was that young blood kept her skin young, kept her beautiful, kept her powerful. Whether this actually happened, or whether it became mythology layered over already horrific truth, historians still argue. But the testimonies were detailed, consistent, and they came from multiple independent sources. Here is what makes this even more disturbing. For years, the Hungarian nobility knew something was wrong. Not suspected, knew. Letters were written. Concerns were raised through official channels. And every single time, the matter was quietly dropped. Because Elizabeth was rich, because she was connected, because she was owed enormous amounts of money by the Hungarian crown. Debts that would conveniently disappear if she were eliminated. Some historians believe that is exactly what eventually motivated King Matthias II to finally act. Not justice, not horror at the crimes, financial and political convenience. In December 1610, a raid was carried out on Csejte Castle. What the soldiers found inside was beyond anything they had prepared for. Bodies in various states, girls still alive in the dungeons, barely. Evidence so overwhelming that even by the brutal standards of the 17th century, the investigators were shaken. One of the first officials on the scene later wrote that he had fought in wars, had seen mass graves, had witnessed plague destroy entire cities, and nothing compared to what he found inside that castle. Elizabeth's accomplices, 4 of them, were arrested, tried, and executed in the most brutal ways the Hungarian legal system permitted. One had her fingers torn off before being burned alive, because the court wanted to make a specific kind of example. But Elizabeth herself was never tried. King Matthias wanted her executed publicly, but the Hungarian noble families resisted. You do not put a Bathory on trial. You do not execute a Bathory in a public square. It was not about guilt or innocence. It was about the precedent it would set, about what it would mean for the entire noble class if one of their own could be brought down like a common criminal. So they made a different decision. Elizabeth Bathory was walled into a set of rooms in Csejte Castle, literally walled in. Small slots were left for food and air. No windows, no door, no trial. No conviction, just disappearance, erasure, as if the court believed that if they pretended long enough, the story would die with her. She lived like that for 3 years and 3 months. In August 1614, a guard looked through the food slot and saw Elizabeth Bathory face down on the floor. She was dead at the age of 54. No cause was ever officially determined. No ceremony was held. She was buried quietly without announcement. And here is the final twist that historians argue about to this day. The number 650, the figure most commonly cited as her victim count, does not come from physical evidence. It comes from a single entry in Elizabeth's own diary, allegedly written in her own hand, listing names. But that diary has never been independently verified. Some scholars believe the number was deliberately inflated by the crown to justify the property seizure that followed her imprisonment. Others believe the real number was even higher, and that the diary was incomplete. The truth is, we do not know. We know girls disappeared. We know witnesses testified under oath. We know the accomplices confessed. We know the castle held evidence that shook hardened soldiers. But the exact scope of what Elizabeth Bathory did inside those walls, the full, complete documented truth, was buried, deliberately, by the most powerful men in Hungary, because a full investigation would have raised questions they did not want answered, about how long they knew, about why they waited, about who else among the nobility had looked the other way. Elizabeth Bathory died in a sealed room, but the questions she left behind about power, about privilege, about who gets to be above the law, those questions did not stay buried. They never do.